Welcome back to another episode of Your Hope-Filled Perspective, where it's always our goal to restore hope, renew minds, and empower listeners to live in their God-given identity. We've got a great show today because we are going to be talking about how God doesn't waste our pain and how we can look at pain as a gift. And if you've been listening to my podcast for even one episode, that seems to be a theme that we talk about a lot, that it doesn't matter what we go through, God redeems it and he doesn't waste it. So I'm excited to talk with our guest today. I want to start off though by sharing with you from Jeremiah 33, verse 69 that says, "Nevertheless, I will bring health and healing to it. I will heal my people and I will let them enjoy abundance, peace, and security. I will bring Judah and Israel back from captivity and I will rebuild them as they were before. I will cleanse them from all the sin they have committed against me and will forgive all their sin of rebellion against me. Then this city will bring me renown, joy, praise, and honor before all nations on earth that hear of all the good things I do for it. And they will be in awe and will tremble at the abundant peace and prosperity I provide for it." That verse today encapsulates what we're going to be talking about when we talk about the fact that God doesn't waste our pain and he will bring good from it. Our guest today is Tera Bradham DeNeui, who's an author, speaker, and a podcast host. She loves to talk to animals like they're humans, curl up with a great book in an equally great blanket, and help others see God's faithfulness amidst their suffering. Her journey has led her across the world to deliver messages of empowerment and purpose. Tera writes and leads the Heal Ministry from her home in Vancouver, Washington. Welcome to the program, Tera.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I am honored to be here.
I'm so blessed to have you here. I heard your story when you were on Johnny and Friends, and I just knew that your message was one that would resonate with my listeners. So let's fill them in a little bit.
Yeah.
I understand that by the age of 12, you were one of the fastest swimmers in your age group, and you had your sights set on the Olympics. But all of that changed dramatically when you suffered an injury, and then 7 years of chronic pain and spiritual darkness. So will you tell us a little bit about that time in your life when you were training and planning for the future?
Yeah, so I fell into the sport of swimming very young and just got very good very early. I just hated to lose. Everyone loves to win, but they say those who win are those who hate to lose. And so that just propelled me far very quickly. And so they have rankings top 16 for age groups in the country in swimming. And so I had a #1 ranking in 3 of those events for about 3 years. And a girl I raced in California went on to go to the Olympics and things. And so that was a realistic track at that age, but a lot can happen between when you're 12 and then when you can go for that. And something did happen, and I threw myself into a wall at the end of a race, and it ended up, unbeknownst to me, but it ripped some of the cartilage in my shoulder off the bone. And then they didn't find it for another 7 years. Had different surgeries, and I'll let you ask which part of that you want. But then it turned into the more, some people have said, a Job-esque saga. But
And
yeah.
I've read your book, and listeners, we're going to make sure that we put Tera's book in the show notes, but she wrote Swimming for Freedom, a true story of faith, hope, and victory. And you can find that. You're going to want to read it because we can only touch on a little bit of her story, but that'll be found in the show notes at drmichelleb.com. But Tera, I want you to delve a little bit into the ways that you lost your health. You had the accident, but there was more to it than that. Will you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it was a slow, I don't know if I would say fade, a slow degeneration, quite literally actually, but as my health deteriorated. So I tore my shoulder when I was 12. It was the perfect storm just because, and I'm sure you know this in your fields, but different bedside manner and different doctors, and they're doing the best they can, but it just ended up, a lot of times I was told that I couldn't handle not being as good anymore because I did stop improving with the shoulder injury. And then I said, well, I want to prove you wrong because that's my personality. And then I would push and push again until I couldn't barely lift my arm, and we would just go in circles, and they were like, you're too young to really have a big injury. And so I just kept trying, and then it started getting really bad. And so I mean, the first few months I kicked, so with my arms at my side, for people unfamiliar with swimming, and that didn't really make it get any better. I still had really sharp pain in my shoulder, and I was like, well, this is what I'm going to do. Went back, swam through all this pain for years until God really helped me surrender that this was an idol in my life. Um, but then the pain just kept getting worse, and different things, and to the point where finally I had one surgery. They're like, oh my goodness, your shoulder has been torn off the bone for 3 years at this point. No, 5 years. I'm thinking 5 years before the first surgery. And then I was like, well, this is it. Like, God humbled me, and he's going to, now we're just going to go back to this track that he had me on, and it'll be for his glory because I've given it to him now. And that is not what happened at all. And so after that, it, people are like, well, how much pain were you really in if you were able to swim? But it was unfathomable on the worst days, and pretty terrible still on the good days. And I just ignored it, because when you're told that this is in your head, it is amazing what you can do, when I didn't know what was going on inside my body. And so eventually, when things started getting very, very bad, I had pain 24/7 from my shoulder to my hand. I mean, to the point where I was in college, and I didn't want to write or type because my hand was throbbing. I started getting really weird sensations. I mean, just about an inch or more on my shoulder was going numb, where I couldn't feel it, tingling, all the nerve stuff. And all the scans, everything came back clear. They're like, no impinged nerves, nothing is going on. We've already been inside your shoulder, so there's nothing, like, it's not a bad test. We've been inside, there's nothing here. This is in your head. And then my immune system started shutting down. And we don't know the whole effects of that, but I mean, I got ulcers. I get those genetically in my mouth when my immune system's low, and I just had so many and was getting sick. And my body literally just started falling apart, all because there actually was something going on in my shoulder that they still weren't seeing.
Now, you read that passage that I read in Jeremiah. That's your life verse.
Yeah.
So when you read that, didn't you feel impressed by the Holy Spirit that he was just going to bring health and healing? So
Yes.
how do you handle it when you have this promise and you're believing for it, and the healing doesn't go the way you imagined it would go?
Yeah. Well, Michelle, I'd love to say, oh, well, you just hang on and, like, until God comes through. And I tried that for a long time, and I got to the point where I couldn't hold on anymore. And I think at that point you have to trust that God's going to grab onto you. But I mean, I got to the point where I was considering not planning anything out, but just having these suicidal thoughts, because I was 19 years old. I had no quality of life. I mean, I couldn't throw a ball. Eventually, I had to quit swimming because I was like, I felt God had told me to do it for his glory, but I was like, I can't do this anymore. Doctors had said if you would just quit swimming, you'd be fine. And I quit, and it got worse. And so I'm sitting there like, I can't pick up a milk carton. I can't, what am I supposed to do with my life? And this is your fault, God, because I stepped out on this promise. I went back to swimming because I believed that you were going to heal me in this lifetime. And now I don't have any quality of life. Whereas if I had quit sooner, maybe I would have. And so in that place, I did lose hope a lot. And I had those verses to cling to. And this is the mystery of God. I think that in his timing, he knows exactly what our breaking point is and exactly when to show up, and he is a drama king. And so he did. And, people are like, well, what if he hadn't at that point? And I don't know. I don't know, but I know that he did let it go as far as the ultimate darkness. And then he showed up.
I read that you prayed, Lord, complicate my life with a holy complication. Tera, that's a brave prayer.
Oh,
So
yeah.
what happened after that? And did you feel betrayal by God?
Yeah, I do struggle with feeling betrayal anyway, and I think that's an interesting concept. And just looking in the Bible at all these great reversals, right? And it's never what we think. But I did pray that prayer. It's from The Circle Maker by Mark Batterson, which I was reading at the time. And that is a very dangerous prayer because my shoulder at that point was getting a little bit better. I had competed my second year at college. I actually, I took the red shirt and I was actually able to swim and had a decent midseason meet. And then I prayed that prayer and things just went downhill almost immediately. And to the point where I then had to quit, and then it got worse. And then I was like sitting in bed up in this is the first scene in the book, but just saying, God, like I have fought and fought and fought and I can't fight anymore. Like I said that your grace is sufficient for me. We've been through this whole thing where literally probably over 100 times a day, I would just say, God, your grace is sufficient for me. Like when I open the door handle, when I have to move my hand down to the bottom of the steering wheel, when I can't do something, when I jump out of my seat at school, just pain shooting through my arm. And every single time I would say, your grace is sufficient for me. And I said, God, I can't say that anymore. Like I am at my breaking point and you said you would show up and you haven't. Like heal me or take me home.
Yeah.
And sounds very audacious in that moment, but it was like this, God, this is what you said and you haven't done it. And I either misunderstood you or maybe you're not the God I thought you are, or maybe you don't exist. But there's something in here not adding up. And so it really came down from, hey, I'm doing a little bit better, the roller coaster of health that some of us are on, to absolute bottom. I don't know how I'm going to keep living like this. Heal me or take me home.
And that was part of the reason I felt that holy nudge, if you will, to ask you to be on the program, because I know many of my listeners, as well as myself, are dealing with chronic pain. And those questions that you just admitted to asking of God,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's where we need to have permission to just be honest with God and say, look, my life isn't going the way I thought it would go, and I expected you to heal. I know you can heal. Why have you not? And how do we go on when we're at the end of ourselves? Friends, we're going to talk more about this and about how we can look at pain as a gift when we come back from this commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to your Hope-Filled Perspective, where my guest today is Tera Bradham DeNeui, and she wrote this book, Swimming for Freedom, that we'll put in the show notes for you. But before the break, we were talking about how she was on track to be an Olympic swimmer when an accident took her out of the sport. Tera, I've heard you say before that you had a lung collapse and your relationship with God became your own. Can you explain what you mean by that and how did that change you?
Yeah, so when my shoulder injury first started, they did a lot of things trying to figure out what was wrong and to fix it. And one of those was a cortisone shot. And this is, just caveat, this does not happen very often, super, super rare. But they stuck it in the back of my shoulder, which is also where a ton of your pulmonary arteries go. And they nicked one of those arteries, which I did not find out until years later. And my pain tolerance being what it is and everything else, I woke up for practice the next morning in some of the worst pain of my life, and then swam a whole practice on it, which was actually a hypoxic workout, which is holding your breath, and was thinking in the middle of that practice, what would happen if I died and who would miss me? Like I clearly knew, not even subconsciously, I was thinking it, so consciously, that this was enough pain that it probably was a threat to my life, and kept swimming. And so I ended up going to my doctor and he sent us straight to the ER, thank goodness, because at that point I had bubbles in my throat, and they ended up finding out that I had tension pneumomediastinum, which is a hole in your lung. So basically, if I got to another practice, it would have collapsed, but then, and they probably couldn't have gotten to me in time. So it was this huge instance for me where, this was the third day of 8th grade. So I, had grown up a Christian and different things. I believe I really did make that conscious choice to follow God, but it was like, wow, life is not guaranteed. And what am I living for? And is that a good thing? It's heavy weight for a 13-year-old, but that totally was the catalyst for me, I think, of okay, let's live like it matters.
Wow. That's the ultimate best case scenario out of a worst case scenario, for you then to have this revelation that will impact the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons that I say so often that God doesn't waste our pain. It
Mhm.
may not be a situation we would want for
Right.
ourselves, but he always uses it to further our relationship with him if we're open to that. Now, I've known plenty of people who have gone through some really hard times and have rejected God
Yeah.
because of those hard times, but you chose then to embrace a relationship with him and live like it matters.
Mm.
Many people with pain admit that it isn't the life that they asked for, it isn't the life they wanted or expected. So, how did your pain impact your relationships with others and with God?
A lot of different answers to that. So, with others at this point, a lot of people told me I was crazy, that things were in my head. My relationship with my coach at the time deteriorated just because he thought I was making excuses, which I think a lot of people in pain get. If doctors can't get to the bottom of it, it's like, well, you're clearly making this up for attention. That's all you really want. And even some of my teammates and my friends thought the same thing of like, okay, well, at this point it's been going on for years. And even just at church, the people who were my best people supposed to be there slowly fell away. And not in a mean way, I don't think, but in a, you come up to someone and you keep saying how are you, and they keep saying, if I'm honest, pretty terrible.
Yeah.
And people don't really like hearing that anymore. And they love that story when it's like, oh man, you had this injury and now they found your shoulder detached from the bone and you're gonna just go to the Olympics again. And everyone was so on board for that. And then, when you lose your quality of life and you have another surgery and they don't find anything and all of that, it's not that they were being spiteful, or it just is like, they didn't know how to help, I don't think.
Yeah.
And so it's very hard to bear witness to someone's pain when you can't help. And it's hard to stay in and pray for someone when you don't see God answering your prayers, because honestly, then it starts questioning your faith.
Right.
And so I think that is something we see a lot in the church. And then, did you say what was my relationship with God? How did that change?
Yeah.
I think I was honestly just blessed with God's grace in the sense of discipline and how that made me with swimming and staying in the word. And so I will say the one thing I would say through all of this is that I was in the word every morning. I got up at 4 so I could have a quiet time before practice. That's when he gave me that life promise in Jeremiah. That's when these things happened. And so I think even amidst this, I was still looking to him. And you said it's people ask these questions, and we do. And I was reading recently, I think Christine Kane put it so beautifully in her new book, that we think that asking questions shows a lack of faith. But really, that's showing the truest faith that we possibly could, because it's saying, God, I don't understand, but I know that I believe in my faith that you are good, that I've seen what you've done across all of these generations. And I know that there is proof that you are real, that you are active and alive and coming back. And if that is the case, I'm going to trust you and say, what is going on? I don't see what you're doing here, but I've seen this person's story and I've seen that person's testimony. And by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony, we overcome. And so I need you to show up here. That doubt, it's cynicism versus doubt, right? The cynicism of standing back saying, God, prove yourself, or just saying, God, help my unbelief. Help me believe. I want to believe. And so I think if you're in the word, if you're listening, he gave me the grace every single day. And that's, he said, people are like, well, what would have happened if he didn't come through right at that moment? Well, honestly, he had given me grace every single day up to that point. And I'm not sure I've ever thought about it until this moment, but you know what? I think I'd have to say he would have kept giving me grace if I was leaning into him, because that's who he is. He redeems it, and he drew me closer. So it's like, I argued, I yelled, I threw my Bible. We had a very active relationship, right? But he pulled me through it. And I was talking to Vinitha Reisner, who has an amazing book, and she said, I've never seen someone who's walked through incredible suffering and seen God be faithful to them in the midst of it. I've never seen that. And someone really experienced suffering in God and seen them walk away. That if you find him there for 7 years amidst depending on him, I'm not saying it's impossible, but man, you've seen God's faithfulness, and it's pretty hard to walk away.
You're right. What do you do when what we see in the natural doesn't match what we know to be true in his promises?
I think you have to cling to them anyway. Like, faith is believing in the unseen, right? That's what the word says. And I think at that point you reach out to people. I mean, see professional help if you need to, but also, like, no shame in that. But that was the last thing I wanted to do, is reach out to friends and all of that. And you're not going to make it alone. Just being honest, that's not how God wired us. And so I think you have to reach out to people and say, hey, my perspective is like this little dot right now, and I need you to make it into a lot bigger and reframe this for me. And then that's what God's word does as well. But I would say it's a mixture of having that person be brave, be vulnerable, have other people speak into your life. Because the thing is when you're in so much pain and your vision is so small, I mean, you have to break out of that. And that's what pain does, right? It just closes you in until all you see is this problem. And then you don't see all the little lights of God's goodness that are actually in your life because you're only right here. And so we have to find other things. I think another thing I would say is serve. And that sounds so counterintuitive, but I have seen, and then I've actually read recently in science that it's true that when you get your mind off of your problems, it actually ends up changing your brain chemistry and everything. And so it's like, well, my shoulder hurts, I don't want to go serve someone, and it radically changes everything. So those are some of the things I would say.
But I think that's so true. I've seen it in my own field working with patients in neuropsychology, but that it goes along with the upside down economy of God.
Yeah.
When we will look beyond ourselves and our own pain and suffering and serve others, we do end up getting a blessing as a result. And it's amazing. I can do these podcast episodes and I can be in the worst pain, and somehow by focusing on someone else's story and sharing that with others, I experience the supernatural anesthesia just long enough to get through these interviews. He does it every time. And I think part of that is because I'm getting out of myself.
Yeah.
That's a lonely, painful place to be. Will you share what shifted your perspective from viewing pain as an enemy to seeing it as a gift?
I think God did that through my journey, but I honestly, Michelle, didn't really use that verbiage until really recently when I read the book, The Gift of Pain by Philip Yancey.
Yeah.
And I had the pleasure of talking to him. What an authentic, amazing person. Could not recommend it more. But he talks about in that book, he worked with Dr. Paul Brand, and he did a lot of work in India mostly, but then later in the US with leprosy patients. And so that whole thing was, he realized, back there was so little known. It was just this disease of fear. And that's what it was in biblical times and everything else. And so people just thought it was so contagious, and so many things that were misconstrued about what this disease did. And so he found out that it actually, not only was it not that contagious, but all these injuries that people are like, leprosy just eats your body. That was not what it was. It was actually, they could not feel. So leprosy deadened their senses to where instead of like, oh, my toe just fell off in the night, it was actually a rat came and ate their toe off because they couldn't feel it. Yeah. And so they got cats to protect them, And so that is the graphic, literal example. But he said, I would give anything for them to feel pain. And what it does is he tried to create a glove for them to wear that they could have pain sensors, but they, humans are so smart that they're like, well, no, I want to hammer this thing. And so they would turn off the pain sensors and keep doing what they want to do and then turn it back on. And then they would still get the blisters and everything else. And the thing is no one has figured out how to turn off pain in our bodies and the system that is. And we are like, this is the worst thing ever. It's like pain is the antithesis of a gift. But if you look at it like that, it's like it's the one thing you can't turn off that points you to God. It's like the alarm saying you can't do this. How do you look to God? How there has to be something more in this world than this, because even if it's not physical, like I know you talk about all kinds, like a lot of my journey is physical, but all pain is equally valid. And everyone has it, right? So when you're dealing with depression, when you're dealing with anxiety, when you're dealing with this chronic pain, or you're dealing with the loss of someone who just passed away, you have to have something to cling to. And that is the gift of it points you to God. And the other reality of like, if you don't have the hope of the resurrection, like Paul says, we're to be pitied more than all other men. If you don't have the hope of eternal life, I mean, yeah, pain seems pretty pointless. But if you have that, it changes everything. It changes absolutely everything.
It does. And in my times of suffering, that is when I've sought out God the most.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when life is going great, we have a tendency to go, I'm good, God. I got this. I'll check back in when I need you. But when you're going through pain, physical, emotional, relational, spiritual, what have you, it does force us to look beyond ourselves and hopefully directs us back to the one who can comfort us in our pain.
Yeah.
You say that you found true freedom despite the pain. What do you mean by that?
I think freedom can be defined a lot of ways, but it's being able to live outside of your circumstances. That to me is true freedom, of saying I am not in bondage to my body. I'm not in bondage to the condition or the diagnosis that people have put on me. I'm not bound to what other people have said about me or my swimming career or what it should have been. I am free to live. This is the life that God has for me. And so freedom amidst that is knowing that God has a purpose and that he's redeeming it, that he is the God who suffered, and that this isn't pointless. And I feel like everything we're talking about could seem so confusing. It's literally like backwards logic.
It is.
But it's like, I've lived it. That's all I can say is I've lived it, and it's true.
And that's why your testimony is so important, because people can't argue with your testimony. Friends, we're going to take a real short commercial break, but when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation about how God doesn't waste our pain and how pain really can be viewed as a gift. We'll be right back. Welcome back to your Hope-Filled Perspective, where my guest today is Tera Bradham DeNeui, and we're talking about the fact that God doesn't waste our pain and that we can view pain as a gift rather than as an enemy. Tera, I'd be curious, based on your story and other testimonies you've witnessed, what do you believe is God's heart in suffering?
So this is the ultimate question, right? And
yep,
this is my answer. This is not from anything. It's just from reading all these things and seeing in my own life. I think that God's heart is to hold us. I think his heart is to hold us in the suffering and to redeem it. And I think he is the God who suffered, right? We can't fathom the suffering that he's, even our worst day. And I would like to say like, oh, it's close. I mean, we were talking about, was it Jim Caviezel? I don't know how to say his name, who played Christ in the Passion. We were talking about this last night and how he had crazy things happen because they hit him by accident, and the things that, okay, if that happened to him playing this in a movie, imagine what Christ really endured. And then add on top of that, the actual separation from God that he took on, that we deserve, that we don't have to feel. I mean, it truly is unfathomable. And then, okay, super promo, The Chosen, huge fan, you should watch it. But like seeing Jesus, and their interpretation of what it could have been like, and just the betrayal of him by his friends and putting flesh on that. And I mean, you want to talk someone who knows pain. Our God knows pain. I mean, unrequited, is that the word? Love, right? Of go through the Bible. Look what Israel did. And like, no, thanks for saving us. Thanks for parting the sea. Like, we actually just want to make a golden calf. So sorry. I mean, the rejection, the betrayal. I mean, he has experienced it all and still loves us. It's insane. And so to know first that he is not allowing something that he hasn't been through, right? That is, I think, the key, and the difference between Christianity and honestly every other religion is that he has suffered. He chose to suffer for us and to love us anyway. And then on top of that, understanding that we do live under a world that has been given temporarily to the hands of Satan, right? And Jesus is coming back. He's going to come back with a sword coming out of his mouth and a tattoo on his leg. Like, we have that assurance. You've seen all the prophecies in the Bible come true. That one will too. Now, right before the resurrection, before that Easter Sunday, that's where we're living. And what our promise is in this is he will be with us. He will never leave you. He will never forsake you. And he will redeem it. That he will work all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. If you love him, he's going to work it out, period. That's it. And I know if I was in this pain, I don't know if this is something that I could believe, truly. But I think at that point you have to borrow some people's faith and some people's testimonies until you see God come through in that way.
Yeah. And that's a way that I have seen him redeem it. By sharing my own story, others have been able to borrow the hope that I have until they see it for themselves. And I think that's what you and your book do as well. Before we close out this episode, though, I want to touch on where and how you think the church has hurt people the most in the realm of physical suffering, and how can we change this culture in the church?
Yeah. So I experienced this, and I also hear it from a lot of people, and it's really heartbreaking, but I believe in a holistic view of healing, that all healing is from God. So what I say in my thesis is that God heals people in the way that brings him the most glory and in the way that brings us closest to him. And so for physical healing, since that's a lot of my story, that can be miraculous. I've seen it, experienced it, totally believe he still works that way. But it can also be medicinal. Maybe it is something that God has given us the mind to produce. Maybe it's oils or plants or whatever these things are that he created, or doctors and their minds and how they help us. Or sometimes it is ultimate healing. We're like, well, God, I prayed for God to heal my dad and he didn't. Well, in the eternal realm, he healed him more fully than any healing he would ever receive on this side. And that's hard, but true. And then sufficient grace, where for whatever reason right now, we don't know why that thorn is not taken away, but God is with us in that suffering. And so that's my view of healing. And yet how I see it happening in the church very often is people say, and I see the passages that can lead people down this road, but they say, well, you don't have enough faith to be healed. And you mentioned Johnny, and her response to that often is, well, actually, maybe you don't have enough faith, because if you look at the friend of the paralytics who dropped him in through the roof, Jesus said it's their faith that has healed you. So maybe it's on you. Yeah. And, I guess when you've lived that many decades as a quadriplegic, she gets a little sassy, right? But it's a good point.
It is.
And so I think that's a huge hurt. And I just feel like it is easier, this cognitive laziness that we have in all kinds of issues in the church, that we don't really want to grapple with this until it affects us. And then we have to. And then we realize that most of the church is either completely legalistic with healing, or they're completely charismatic. And it's like the gifts are dead, God doesn't heal, or you have to have enough faith to be healed. And it's not, you know what? Let's grapple with the mystery of why God heals some people miraculously and why not others, and why it's different. And you know what? If he heals people in all of these different ways, maybe the whole point is that it's not actually about the healing physically. It's about what is going on in our hearts and our spirit. And that's the deeper root underneath it all. And so, I see people coming up for prayer, different things. And, a guy went up for prayer for his finances, and they prayed for him for his health because he was in a wheelchair, different things like that. I think we need to be talking about this. And I think, talking about racism and all these things that are being thrown at us, right? That it's just like, well, how am I supposed to make a difference? And so it's like, man, this is just like one more thing of overwhelm of what am I supposed to do? And I think there are a lot of things, right, that I'm trying to do with our ministry, but literally just start with talking about it. I think that's where you have to start is let's just acknowledge, hey, what does the Bible actually say about this? There are there are some studies, and I'm trying to make more because there aren't enough on this topic, but going through, like, what does the Bible actually say about this? Because what I have found is that God heals in a lot of different ways. And then, hey, why don't you go have dinner with the church family whose daughter has autism and why don't you go take a meal to someone who is not able to get to church, right? And see what their mindset is. Because if you haven't experienced it, right, just open the door to saying, you know what, I'm actually going to grapple with this. And, if you wrestle with God like Jacob did, you're going to walk away with the limp, and know that you're probably going to come out with a limp, but you're going to come out closer to God and not having let go.
I think too often we want to give easy pat answers and we want to put God in a box, and he just refuses to be kept in a box.
Yep.
As we close out this episode, if a listener is struggling with pain of any kind, emotional, physical, relational, spiritual, you have it. What hope-filled perspective would you want to leave them with today as someone who understands the agony of pain?
Yeah. Michelle, this is such a hard question, and I think it changes depending on the day, right? But I would say there's always hope. There's always hope. Even when you think there is not. There is, because Jesus is on the throne. He's coming back. There is always hope. Please do not give up. I think God is doing more than you realize, right? As my shoulder was degenerating, I guess we didn't even share that. They can get the book, right? But they found that my shoulder was degenerating inside of me, that you're not crazy, but there is timing, and his grace really is sufficient. It is. And so just know that God might be doing more than you realize. He might be like, you know what, you're going to start a ministry someday and you don't even know what's coming. And that's what I'm doing right now in this pain. And I think I would just say God is, what I have found more and more lately is that he is different than I think he is, but he's better. He's better. So it's okay if God is not who you thought he was, but I am willing to bet my life on the fact that he's better than you think.
Such a good word. Friends, Tera keeps bringing up 2 Corinthians 12:9, so I feel like that's an appropriate way to close out this episode. And that says, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. That's what I want you to take away from this episode, is that none of us want to go through pain, but it's during those times that we really have the opportunity to see God be true to his word, to test his promises. And like Tera just said, a promise, his grace is sufficient. But when you wonder, it's okay to ask him. He's big enough to handle your questions. And in the long run, if you will surrender your pain to him for his purposes, I promise you, he won't waste it. He will never, ever waste your pain. But friends, you might not be going through a painful time right now, but you might know someone who is. So consider sharing this episode with someone who needs hope and encouragement while they struggle through a painful trial. And while you're there, would you consider subscribing to the podcast so you don't miss a single episode? Tera, thank you for coming on, sharing your story, sharing the hope that you have. And friends, we will put Tera's book and her ministry in the show notes that you can find at drmichelleb.com. Until we meet again next week, may you have a hope-filled week.